On episode 469 of the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, we bring back Gary Taubes to discuss his book, The Case for Keto. You can find the full show notes for this episode at 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/469. Have you decided you're ready to make a change? To reclaim your health and fitness? The 40 Plus Fitness Podcast is here for you. I'm your host, Alan Meisner. I'm an NSAM certified personal trainer with a specialization in corrective exercise and fitness nutrition. Let me be your coach as you find your way on your health and fitness journey. All right, let's go. In the introduction music for this podcast, I ask a very simple question. Are you ready to change? The answer for most of us is yes. And since you're still listening to this podcast, I assume your answer is also yes. But change is hard. For many of us, wanting to change and going it alone just doesn't work. We need support, structure, and accountability. I'm launching a 12-week group training program that does just that. This program will help you lose weight and get more fit. And unlike most personal trainers, I guarantee that if you have weight to lose, you will lose at least 15 pounds on this program. As I said in the intro, I want to be your coach. If you'd like to work directly with me, this is your chance. Email me, alan@40plusfitness.com, or message me on Facebook, 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/group. Make 2021 your year with 40 Plus Fitness online personal training. Raz, how are things going?
Good. How are you today, Alan?
I'm doing okay. Working on getting the gym open. We got some space next door, so we've been able to spread the equipment out a little bit more, which should help when we go to the health department. And my goal is before the end of this month to have the gym open. And now it's just some final cleanups and put-togethers and things like that to get it all ready. And then I've got a crew scheduled to come in and help me do some deep cleaning. So we're going to, I got everything set up, and then I got to pull everything apart and clean it all up and then put it all back in.
Wow.
And yeah, it's a lot of work. I've done it a few times myself over the years. And one of the things that I've come to understand is that you can't go 11 months without significant training. You know, I'm doing some training, but not like I was before. My strength has dropped. I'm not as strong. So I actually had to hire some people to help me move a piece of equipment today.
Oh boy.
It was a piece of, I moved it all over the gym before, but it is really, really heavy. It probably weighs about 400 pounds. So it's not a light piece of equipment, but I used to be able to just drag it all over the gym. Not a problem. But wasn't happening for me today. I gave it a tug. It moved about 4 inches, and I'm like, okay, I really have to move this about 20 feet. So, you know,
wow,
little 4-inch increments. That was a lot of pulling. So I went out and I asked a couple of local guys that work at the water taxi across the street. And I said, you guys want to help me out? And I said, I think I'm going to need about 2 of you. And 2 of them came in, and one of them came in. And he's like, he was going to get underneath it and lift it up. And I'm like, it's kind of heavy. He says, I'm really strong. I said, well, I am too. And then he went to make the tug, and it didn't move at all. And his friends laughed at him. And then they went and got another guy in there to help us. So it's 3 guys and myself, and we got it moved. But
oh, how wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, how crazy.
It is. But it was fun. And I'm getting things, and it's lining up. And so I'm hopeful we can get the health department here in Bocas to see it as a good place for people to be and exercise. We'll have a cleanup plan, have everything going. So a lot of moving and shaking there. And then, of course, you know, I've started kind of launching a 12-week program for my online trainees and, you know, for people over 40. And it's, that's going really well. I'm super excited about the folks that are coming in. They're energized. You know, our private Facebook group is there where we're checking in. Everybody's getting really excited and doing some things here. So, you know, and even just the first couple check-ins of folks coming through, I'm like, wow, you guys are you're just flooring me. Yeah. I've got some awesome people in there. And it just every day seems to be getting better and better.
Isn't that exciting? I love to see when people get excited about trying something new, a new training program or something, and really taking the reins on what they want out of their health and fitness. I love that.
Yeah. Well, of course, me too. That's why I'm doing this.
For sure.
So what have you been up to?
Actually, something similar myself. I love resolutions. I love making plans at the beginning of the year. I love the idea of settling in on a goal. And I have some big running goals for myself this year. But in order to reach those goals, I know I need to branch out and do some other things besides running. So I've been putting together a body weight routine that I call the runner's workout. I'm putting the final touches on it, and I hope to have it ready to share pretty soon.
Well, cool. I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Yeah,
That's going to be really good. That's really
it's
good.
fun.
All right. So today our guest is Gary Taubes, and Gary's one of my favorite people because he thinks like a journalist, but he also understands health really, really well. And so he gets into these concepts of keto. So the book is called A Case for Keto, and I've had him on before, The Case Against Sugar. And he sold me on that one for sure. Because now I'm as against sugars as ever. But his book, Case for Keto, is really, really good. And I was really excited to have him on the podcast again. So I guess let's go ahead and have that conversation with Gary. Our guest today is an award-winning investigative science and health journalist and co-founder of the nonprofit Nutrition Science Initiative. He is the author of Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, Good Calories, Bad Calories, and The Case Against Sugar. With no further ado, here's Gary Taubes. Gary, welcome to 40 Plus Fitness.
Alan, thank you for having me.
Well, this is the second time you've been on the show. We had you on for The Case Against Sugar, which was episode 224. That was 245 episodes ago. And I still recommend go read the book Case Against Sugar. It's as relevant, if not more relevant today than it was then in 2017. And the book we're going to talk about today is called The Case for Keto: Rethinking Weight Control and the Science of Low Carb, High Fat Eating. And the thing I like, Gary, about the way that you approach these topics is that you put together a case, which is what you're doing. You're thinking in terms of, how do I build up a body of evidence that really proves this? And it's not just you're going to go across and says, well, everybody knows, and then stop and just use that as your anchor. You have no anchors, but the fact that you've done more research than probably anyone else in the field of nutrition, which is actually kind of sad considering you're a journalist and not a scientist. But you've done more work in the nutrition field to understand why we think the way we do, why we do the things we do, and why things work the way they do inside our bodies than maybe any other human being on earth. And it's just fascinating to read your stuff.
Well, thank you. It's funny, as a journalist, you just keep asking questions until I would like to say until there are no questions left to be asked, but basically you will reach a sort of a point of diminishing returns where your mathematicians are saying you're asymptotically approaching the end point. And when I started this almost 25 years ago, I had no biases. I believed what we all believed about a low-fat diet and red meat being deadly. And then I was an investigative journalist with a science background. So I stumbled into this field. I wanted to know what the truth was. I just kept asking questions. I also hate writing. So research is a great procrastination tool. As long as you keep doing research, you don't actually have to sit down and do the hard work of synthesizing it and making it readable.
Well, you did. And thank you for that, because you went through an entire history, and that's another thing. I mean, as we're talking about why we are where we are, we have to kind of understand some of the history. It's not, if we try to put that anchor point in of this is the ultimate truth, and we don't go back and at least understand where that truth came from and question that truth, which you as a journalist do, then there's a lot of things that can go wrong. The way I kind of think about this is in terms of geometry. You work as a kid, you're working a geometry problem, and they make you show your work. And so you sit down, you prove that first thing, and then therefore you can prove the second thing, and therefore you can prove the third thing. And you have to do all three of those in that order, or it doesn't work. And a lot of the science we have right now skip through the first two proofs, and now we're at the third proof. This book doesn't do that. Yeah. Why are we where we are? And what happened? What went wrong?
Well, so this is what's so to me. So my obsession has always been good science and bad science, more so than nutrition. It's just the themes in bad science play out so well in nutrition and so continuously, and obesity and diabetes research also. But one of the things that fascinated me is, so I grew up in the physics world. In physics, you learn the science with the history attached, right? In part because as you move forward in time, the science gets more complicated. So you start with like Newton's laws, and you learn about Newton, and you learn about the laws. And every law has a name attached to it. Every discovery has someone's name attached to it, whether it's the variables, the units, being Teslas and Gausses and ohms. These are all people's names. So you learn who did the work, what they did, what they saw, what the alternative hypotheses were. You get to Einstein's theory of relativity. It's only when you get to quantum physics in the 20th century that we tend to start using the name, leaving the names behind. But any student of physics knows who did the work, and what they did, and what experiments were done to test it, and what those experiments saw. And in medicine, you don't do that. The textbooks don't talk about the history. There's too much to learn. There's too much you have to digest in order the theory goes to diagnose and treat patients. So maybe the idea is you just don't have time to learn it. So as a journalist, when I got into this, I wanted to learn the evidence base first behind the idea that salt causes high blood pressure, and that led me to the evidence behind dietary fat and heart disease, and that led me to the obesity story. So as a journalist, you start going back in time because we've accepted certain facts as a dogma or consensus. So you go back in time to find out when they were still up for grabs, when there was still a controversy and no consensus formed over what we believed, and you see what the evidence was and what forged the controversy. Was it compelling evidence, or was it political, sociological forces? And in nutrition and obesity, it was always the latter. Go all the way back to the early 20th century for obesity. And again, when we think of an obesity research community today, we think of, hundreds, thousands of researchers around the world studying animals. Back then, obesity research constituted, a dozen physicians around the world. There were the German and Austrian clinicians who had their schools of thinking, and they had institutes with physician researchers in them. And these dozen people would write articles about obesity every few years. And in those articles, they might speculate as to what the cause was. And there were two ideas of what the cause of obesity was. One is people eat too much, the gluttony idea. Sloth wasn't that much of an explanation back then. But, you had Falstaff, a big, heavy set guy with a zest for living, sitting in a barn. He's got a leg of lamb in one hand and a tankard of ale in the other. And the reason he's fat is because he's a glutton. And that was sort of the general thinking. And then the other hypothesis was that obesity is a hormonal disorder, that some people just put on weight no matter how little they eat. Okay, so some of us are predisposed to get fat, others aren't. The Germans and Austrians had embraced this hormonal predisposition idea, even though they didn't know how hormones regulated fat accumulation. And in 1930, an American researcher named Louis Newberg comes along from the University of Michigan. And he claims for the first time ever to have actually tested these two hypotheses experimentally. No one had ever done that before. And he claimed that the overeating hypothesis won. This was based on basically what he did is he put some lean people on a semi-starvation diet, some obese people on a semi-starvation diet, and he said they kind of lost weight equally. Didn't matter whether they were lean or obese, therefore the obese people didn't have some hormonal predisposition to make them trap fat. And nobody had ever done this. So Newberg in the United States particularly is kind of embraced as getting it right. And it fit preconceptions, right? Because lean physicians, if you're lean, it's easy to think that people get fat because they eat too much. The Europeans, the Germans and Austrians kind of made fun of this energy balance idea, didn't explain anything. So if you want to explain, like, for instance, not just whether or not someone's obese or not, but like why men and women fat differently. Men put on fat above the waist, women tend to put on fat below the waist. So clearly hormones are involved, like why there's certain areas in our bodies we accumulate fat and other areas we don't. Why there are things like, lipomas, fatty tumors. All of these are independent of energy balance. And you want a theory of obesity should be a theory of fat accumulation, right? So all of that is argued out in a few papers that go back and forth. The Austrian clinical investigator named Julius Bauer, one of the leading figures in the field of endocrinology, says the energy balance thing is nonsense. The overeating hypothesis doesn't tell you anything. Newberg responds that hormonal hypothesis doesn't tell you anything. World War II comes along. The European, German, Austrian schools evaporate. And post-World War II, Newberg's overeating energy balance hypothesis is just embraced as fact. Clearly, fat people overeat. And then, for whatever reason, people start evoking the laws of thermodynamics as somehow relevant to this. So, and by the 1960s, you've got obesity research is dominated by psychologists and psychiatrists who, are trying to get fat people to eat less. And at the same time, you've got, beginning in the 1930s through the mid-1960s, a series of metabolism researchers, physiologists, PhDs mostly rather than MDs, who actually work out in the lab what regulates fat accumulation and the role different hormones play in regulating fat accumulation. And by the mid-1960s, it's clear that insulin dominates fat storage. The hormone insulin, it orchestrates fuel partitioning in the body, when we burn fuels versus when we store them, use them for repair and regeneration. But it's the hormone that puts fat in fat tissue and keeps it there. And so by the mid-1960s, you should have a hypothesis that obesity is a hormonal regulatory disorder, just like the Germans and Austrians had always said, where insulin dominates the link to diet. And so all of this is just ignored because the obesity community has decided fat people eat too much. Even when you look at the research in the field, they're not trying to explain fat accumulation. Like you look at, for instance, the discovery of leptin, which is seen as a satiety hormone. The researchers are trying to explain appetite and hunger and why fat people might eat too much rather than why fat people might accumulate too much fat, which is an entirely different question. So the latter is answered pretty much by elevate insulin and keep it elevated as it is in insulin resistant, and you're going to accumulate too much fat. But that's not even what we've been studying. And then the dietary implications, of course, are a disaster because for 80 years, 90 years, physicians tell their patients to eat less and exercise more because they think they're eating too much. And that's not why they're getting fat.
Yeah. So when I was in high school, I thought I was going to be an NFL football player and offensive lineman. Thought I was going to be this big, huge dude. Stopped growing in the 10th grade and couldn't put on any weight. I could eat and eat and eat and eat. And in fact, I really strongly believe that it was those eating habits that I developed when I was a teenager that set me up for having metabolic problems later, because it was the type of food. I was drinking a lot of milk, like a gallon of milk a day. I was eating loaves of bread because, those were the things that put some weight on me. And so, I when I was younger, I was one of those folks that you would call just naturally lean. He can eat anything and everything and stay naturally lean. That changed drastically after I turned 30. which again is about the same time that certain hormones like testosterone and, obviously I was working now in corporate, so my cortisol levels, I wasn't the carefree teenager anymore. My cortisol levels were obviously a lot higher. So I moved into the category in the book that you call fat and easily. Uh, and I think
Yeah.
people will see this and they know this intrinsically. I'll have male clients and female clients, and the male clients, if they really start working on the right things and do the things that are improving their overall health, they bounce back and they start losing weight a lot faster than females do. So a woman moves into menopause, and because her hormones change, the structure of how and where she stores fat changes. So to sit there and completely poo-poo hormones as having any involvement in this, just I don't quite get it.
And this is what's so fascinating. So on one hand, I mean, it's an interesting dynamic. Remember, so Newberg did this, because he had to answer questions after he said it's always eating too much. Obesity is always caused by eating too much. And so people said, what about menopause? If you look at, and I did it even in the literature on animal literature in the 1920s, you can find endocrinologists saying, well, animals when you remove the ovaries in a female animal, that animal get fatter. And so clearly what we're doing is removing, it's not secreting estrogen anymore, and estrogen's inhibiting fat accumulation. I mean, I think it was in the case against sugar, I had a reference from 1927 making that point. And endocrinology is the term has barely even been coined by that time. They're still calling glands ductless glands, and the researchers studying animals know that female animals will get fatter if you remove their ovaries. But so what's happening in humans? And Newberg says, well, it's got nothing to do with hormones. Even in women going through menopause, they're just, what happens is their kids are grown, they're out, they're bored with their husbands. I mean, incredibly sexist discussions going on. And they don't really care how they look anymore, and they're playing bridge with their lady friends all day long and eating bonbons. So it's still overeating. And they said, well, what about children of obese parents? Because Julius Bauer had done some of the first research showing that, we had 500 obese patients, and 400 of them had at least one obese parent. Forget the exact number. So clearly it's genetic. And why wouldn't you expect it to be genetic? No, it's not genetic. It's, children with obesity learn to overeat from their parents with obesity. The groaning board, they called it. They just put too much food out on the table, and they don't learn to control their appetites. So they had an argument that nothing could be hormonal. And when Bauer attacks Newberg, and you see this today with, bloggers and everywhere, and politicians, rather than ease off the argument a little, Newberg hardened it. It's like, nothing can be hormonal, because if anything could be hormonal, perhaps it could all be hormonal. And then the idea of hormones were easily accepted as an excuse. Well, that's what fat people was trying to understand the Me Too movement, or even the Black Lives Matter movement, because as a older white male, I'm being told that I fundamentally cannot understand their perspective, and they're right. Okay, they're just right. I can't. And then it struck me that what we've got is lean people who are giving us diet advice, right? The idea is if it's eating too much, the difference between, if you take two 18-year-olds, a good example, my brother and I, when we graduated from high school, he was 2 years older, but his senior year, he played football. He was 6 feet tall and 190 pounds, 6'5" and 190, and I was 6'2" and 190. Or 195. We both played football. We were both pretty good. He never got over 195 pounds, and I went up to 240. He couldn't. He ate more than I did. Undeniably. I mean, we would both accept that. So the difference was, the idea is the reason I went to 240 is I ate too much, and the reason he never went over 195 is he didn't, even though he ate far more than I did.
Yeah.
So you've got these lean people giving this advice, and they don't know what it means. They don't understand what it's like to slowly get fatter year in and year out, no matter what you do. right?
Yeah.
So we've all been through this. You restrict what you eat, you give up sweets, you do your, calorie counting, and no matter what you do, and this is why I use that phrase, fat and easily, which is like 1950s diet book terminology. But some of us fatten easily, and if you're not one of us, you can't understand what that's like. And you can't just say, well, you got to eat less, dude. Or, get out and run around the track, because that doesn't stop our bodies from wanting to fatten easily. And we have to understand why our bodies are doing that. You're lucky. Your body doesn't do that. Just like somebody who wants to play basketball is lucky if they grow to 6'8" rather than 6 feet tall. And we know that's hormonal.
Yeah.
Right?
Not because they ate too much.
Not because they ate more than the 6 foot. Well, and it's funny. It's what the first guy, German, Gustav von Bergman, who advocated, sort of wrote up this hormonal idea and made fun of this eating balance and the energy balance idea. Said, a growing child is hungry all the time. That's not why he's growing. And you would never tell the child, look, if you would just eat less, you won't get so tall. Because we know they're not related. And yet you turn this into obesity, they're growing outward instead of upward, and suddenly you flip all the causality, and telling them to eat less is somehow a solution. And it's just not.
Now, you said something in the book that just kind of resonated with me, and probably something I should just have posted somewhere for people to read whenever we're talking, particularly when they're dealing with hunger, is that you indicated in the book, hunger is a response, not a cause.
Right. Well, this is, if you look at any biological system other than obesity, hunger is a response to a calorie deficit. Basically, you burn more calories. So if you're growing, you're going to be hungry because your body is in positive energy balance. It's building bones and muscles and connective tissue, and it needs the energy to do that, and it needs the resources to create that new growth. And the response is you're hungrier than you are if your body isn't growing. The examples I used in Why We Get Fat, my second book, was, an elephant eats more than an armadillo, because it eats in several orders of magnitude more food because it's several orders of magnitude bigger. We never have a system where the amount consumed drives the growth of the system. It's always the growth process that determines the amount consumed. And what's fascinating is in nutrition. So remember, we've got these lean people. Newberg, by the way, was pencil thin. We've got them saying, look, fat people get fat because they eat too much, so they should eat less. And if they eat less, they'll lose the weight and everything will be fine. But we actually had an experiment to look at what happens when lean people eat less. And that was this famous experiment by Ansel Keys, who in the early 1940s was a relatively young, ambitious nutrition researcher at the University of Minnesota. This was before his dietary fat work. And he did an experiment, famous experiment on starvation. And he published 2 books, 2 volumes of the biology of human semi-starvation. And it was a semi-starvation experiment. So we got 30, I forget if it was 32 or 34 conscientious objectors. And the idea was to understand the physical and psychological consequences of semi-starvation, because when we won the war in Europe, the assumption was we would be confronted with famine conditions in particularly Eastern Europe, and we would have to know how to treat these people, and we'd have to understand medically what they're going through. So the diet that Keys fed these conscientious objectors was similar to what they expected they would see in Eastern Europe. So it's tubers like potatoes and turnips and a little green vegetables and some very lean, small portions of meat. So it's a low-fat, low calories, about 1,600 calories a day, even though it's referred to as a semi-starvation diet. That's what we're told men are told to eat if they want to lose weight at the rate of 1 pound or 2 a week. So 1,600 calories a day of a low-fat, mostly plant diet, a very healthy diet by today's standards. And the obvious consequence of this diet, not surprisingly, if you feed someone a semi-starvation diet, they get exceedingly hungry because they're only eating half the calories that they need. So they thought about food constantly. They obsessed about food. They wrote about food in their diaries. If they had gum, they chewed gum constantly. They dreamt about food at night. They weren't allowed out of the lab to walk around town without a buddy system because they couldn't be trusted not to cheat if they were allowed out of the confined area where the study was going on. Several of the subjects suffered what Keyes and his colleagues called, I think they called it semi-starvation neurosis or psychosis. They had mental breakdowns. One of them tried to mutilate himself, actually successfully cut off several fingers with an axe, claiming it was an accident so he could get out of the study. So the point is, the assumption is a lean person can tell a person who suffers from obesity to eat less and maybe 1,600 calories a day, and that person will just lose weight. That's all. The fat tissue will give up the excess calories and they'll be fine. But the reality is we know that if a lean person were to eat 1,600 calories a day, they'd be starving and unable to sustain it. By the way, the other thing that happened at the end of this trial, they lost 15 pounds in the first 3 months, and then weight loss slowed down and sort of ground to a halt. So eventually their weight loss was not all that meaningful. They didn't have a lot of extra fat to lose. Then they start refeeding them. Okay, so now you're refeeding semi-starved individuals, and they're voraciously hungry. And they had to slow down the feeding so they wouldn't get sick, but they still could eat like 10,000 calories a day. And they ended up all putting on more fat than they lost, which Keyes and company called post-starvation obesity. And the comment in the book is we've all been there, right? We've all tried to starve ourselves, lose the weight, and then eventually you end up with binge behavior because you can't sustain it. And you end up fatter than you started. All of this had been documented in lean people, and yet that's still the advice. And in lean people, conceivably the most famous nutrition experiment in history. And yet the lean people who tell us to eat less don't pay attention to that, because if they did, they would have to figure out something else to tell us.
Yeah, when I was in the Army, in the infantry, and so we're training, and the way they would work is they had these meals ready to eat, MREs, that they would give us. And each one was 1,000 calories, and we were allotted 3 of them in a day. So, I'm a young, healthy male, 25, 26 years old, 20 years old, 21, 22. And they're giving me 3,000 calories a day, and I'm losing a pound a day. So if I went out for 2 weeks, I'd lose 14 pounds. And I didn't really have that much extra body fat to lose at that point in time, because at the time I was about 185 pounds, maybe 195, so relatively lean. But I would lose a pound a day if I was out, and I was doing everything I could to find calories. So there were people who liked coffee. At the time, I wasn't interested in coffee. I would trade my coffees for their cocos. I'd say, "Are you eating your creamer and your sugar?" And if they weren't going to use their creamer and sugar, I would barter for that, and I would take those and make little sugar cookies. And so I was learning all of these little tricks on how I could get more food. And in fact, we were going in an exercise, and this other group came in, and our job was just to disrupt them. And when they came in and dropped their packs off, we ran them off of their packs. When we came back through, we realized they had food in their packs. So we stole all their food.
And this is the funny thing, because you were lean, right? It's not funny, it's tragic. But because you were lean, nobody judged you.
Yeah.
As though you were a glutton or a sloth, or you lacked willpower or anything like that. You were just hungry, and you were doing what you needed to do to get the food you wanted. But had you been overweight, or obese, and someone had seen you stealing that food, they'd blame your lack of willpower for the for being overweight or obese. I had a conversation with, the nutritionist at NYU recently through email, who's been arguing for decades that it's all about calories. And, she told me that her father had been obese and he definitely had a voracious appetite. And I said, but look, I've eaten dinner with her over the years. I once took her out to a wonderful, amazing Italian restaurant in Greenwich Village to thank her for being a source for one of my very first article on dietary fat. And I said, you've seen me eat, right? I am twice your size. I eat more than twice the amount of food you eat. And I will leave the table hungry. But you don't judge it because I'm not obese, right? The reason I eat twice as much as you do is because I'm twice as big as you are. It's that simple. And if my body was trying to get bigger still by putting on fat, I'd be hungrier still. And she may have actually gotten that. Again, in this world, people, very common phenomena, when you try to get people to shift paradigms literally from this energy balance thinking and gluttony and sloth to hormonal regulatory thinking and insulin and carbohydrates, you can get them to shift momentarily, but inevitably they snap back to the way they always believed.
Yeah, there's a little bit of data there, and when you'll get into a study where they'll do a low carb versus a high carb switch, and but typically when they do that, they're really not going low carb. They're going more of a moderate carb kind of thing. And what they typically will show is for the first 6 weeks or so, these individuals that are on a low carb diet lose more weight. But then they'll say 6 months later, everything's pretty much even. And I'm like, well, most of them weren't trained that's how they were supposed to keep eating. So they went back to their old way of eating. And basically all you did was really, gave them a short-term thing. And then you didn't pay attention to the fact that if they'd continued doing that thing for 6 months, it probably would have made quite a bit of difference.
Well, the nutrition community has all kinds of excuses for why they can do bad experiments. So when they do those experiments, they don't test, for instance, whether a ketogenic diet leads to more weight loss than a low-fat or mostly plant diet. When the diets are sustained, they test the intervention. So they say, well, we've told people to eat a low-fat diet, and we've told people to eat a ketogenic diet, and we gave them, Atkins' book and Ornish's book or something like that. And then we just had them come in. We wanted to, they won't write it up like this.
Yeah.
So they'll assume that they'll write it up as though the people stayed on the diets. And then if you criticize it and say, well, clearly from your data that people didn't stay on the diet. And they say, well, then we know the diets are unsustainable. And, I co-founded a not-for-profit to try and improve the quality of nutrition science. We did some interesting experiments, but we did not succeed at improving this quality of nutrition science.
I guess the point I'm trying to get to is we're responsible for ourselves. And if we really want to get to the bottom of and most of us, I think, if we're listening to this and thinking we need to lose some weight, we probably fatten easily. We're probably not naturally lean. So we need to do something different than what is there, something different than what we've done. And, if you've been concerned about the keto diet, just try an experiment. And the experiment is to work with your hormones, looking at your carbs and your protein and your fat. And so, Gary, if someone was going to sit down and say, okay, I'm going to do an experiment. The subject is 1, so my N equals 1, and I'm going to do this experiment. How should they structure their experiment?
Okay, so, and this is why I wrote the book, by the way, among other things, so people know that they can do this. It's not going to kill them. 20 years ago, you would have, when I first did this as an experiment, I kept waiting for my heart attack. And then they have to understand how to do it right. Like any experiment, you have to get the methodology correct. So what we're doing with a low carb, high fat or ketogenic diet. So remember, we broach this idea. The hormone insulin regulates fat accumulation. Insulin goes up, you store fat, insulin comes down, you start to mobilize it and oxidize it. What's often not discussed is when insulin comes down, there's a threshold effect. So, and when I interviewed the researchers who studied fat metabolism, a phrase they often used was that fat cells are exquisitely sensitive to insulin. So if you're secreting even a little bit of insulin, your fat cells are detecting that, and that insulin is inhibiting what's called lipolysis, which is mobilization of fat from the fat cell. So what you want to do, if you're overweight or obese, you want to get fat out of your fat cell. So the fat cell has to lipolyze the fat it's stored so it could come out, and then you want to burn it for fuel. And to do that, you have to minimize your insulin levels, probably. So a ketogenic diet minimizes insulin. That's what it does. And it does that by replacing the carbohydrates you consume, all the carbohydrate-rich foods, so everything other than green leafy vegetables and insulin. It's a high-fat diet. So you're not eating grains, sweets, starches, legumes, pulses, because they're all relatively carb-rich. You're eating green leafy vegetables, eggs, meat, fish, fowl, butter, animal sources of fat. In practice, it's actually very easy to do. It sounds complicated, but breakfast, if you eat breakfast, and most of us in this world, or many of us, are now doing intermittent fasting as well, so time-restricted eating, so we just don't eat breakfast anymore. But if you do, instead of your usual carb sources, toast, cereal, juice, skim milk, fruit, you're eating eggs and bacon. It's the hardest thing to get over, is the belief that eggs and bacon are going to kill you, or eggs and sausage, or kippers, and sour cream, trout, leftover food from dinner, and then your lunch is, I don't know. I lived in New York LA when I first did this as an experiment, and I was a writer and I was unmarried, so you tend to eat out every meal at inexpensive restaurants. And so I'd go out, and instead of getting half a roast chicken with French fries and broccoli, I would order the half roast chicken, say, hold the fries, give me a double order of broccoli. Or, hold the fries or the baked potato, give me an extra order of salad. And so you end up eating more green leafy vegetables than you ever did. So vitamin deficiencies are not an issue. Same for dinner. Dinner was, instead of steak and potatoes and broccoli, it was steak and broccoli. You're just not eating the starches, the grains, and the sugar, basically.
Yeah.
And most people who do this see and do it right. So the idea, remember, is also, insulin dominates fat accumulation. Carbohydrates dominate insulin, regulation. So the simplest way to think of this is carbohydrates are fattening. That's what our parents' generation grew up believing anyway. And so if carbohydrates are fattening, you don't eat them. Because at any time in which you eat them, they will work to make you fatter. And if you try to prevent yourself from getting fatter, they'll just make you hungry. So you abstain from carbs, you replace it with fatty sources of food. You don't worry about the fat content as long as it's coming from sort of naturally occurring foods, and people get healthier. They do. In the book, I describe this sort of cognitive dissonance between two conflicting definitions of a healthy diet. One is what we're told to eat: fruits, vegetables, whole grains, pulses, legumes, lean meat in moderation. And the other is what actually makes people like you and me healthier, which is green leafy vegetables and meat, fish, and fowl, and dairy, and eggs.
Yeah, it was interesting because someone posted on my Facebook group, they were struggling with keto. They had some struggles with keto, and they wanted a balanced keto diet. And then, of course, there was another person that responded, isn't that an oxymoron? And I had to respond and say, absolutely not. I mean, I probably eat, I would say, ounce for ounce more vegetables because they're leafy green than I do eat meat when it's all said and done. And yeah, there's some fat in there to make it actually taste delicious. Um, but it's just because everybody wants to nitpick, and they're like, "Oh, it's the bacon diet." And I'm like, "Well, they have a little bit of bacon. It's a condiment. It's an aside. It's like that's not their main protein. We're not all sitting around running around eating pounds and pounds of bacon." Now, yes, there are some people that are doing that, but in a general sense, you can have a balanced, fully nutritious diet. You have to have the understandings of what your body needs with regards to vitamins, minerals, and particularly electrolytes if we're going to go into ketosis, because we're going to flush some water. And just understanding those basic things is just a function of knowing how your body responds to food and eating appropriately.
And that's it. It's unlearning a lot of the simplistic crap we were taught, and then basing thinking about your diet in terms of human physiology instead of some, like we're thermodynamic experiments. My favorite part, so part of what I did in this book, I interviewed over 120 odd physicians who had converted to this way of thinking. I estimate there are a few tens of thousands now worldwide, at least, who do this, but who now eat this way themselves and prescribe it to their patients. And then by interviewing all these physicians, I could understand the challenges to them and to their patients and how they overcame those challenges. And at the end of the book, I give advice based on and ways to both think about this and do this, so that eating a low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic regime is something you can do for a lifetime. But I think my favorite chapter is I start with the quote from a doctor named Gary Taubes, who's a spine surgeon in Ohio. And Carrie comes from a family with a history of obesity and says, without understanding her diet, she'd be 300 pounds. She's also has type 1 diabetes now, and she's a vegan. And she eats a vegan ketogenic diet, and she does so because she can't tolerate animal products. So she always had some ethical issues with them, and she grew up ethically opposed to eating them, but she would do it if her body tolerated it. It just doesn't seem to do it. And she said it's not a religion, it's just about the way I feel. It's just about how I feel. And to me, ultimately, that's kind of what we're doing here. And I play Gary Taubes off against Georgia Eads, who's a psychiatrist in Western Massachusetts, whose body doesn't seem to tolerate plant foods. And so Georgia is now a carnivore. It's all she eats exclusively is meat. And that's what makes her feel healthy and able to achieve a healthy weight. And as long as you know that you don't have any vitamin and mineral deficiencies, and that your lipids are not insane, whatever that means, of self-experiments, until you found dumping crap food on us. And so we didn't really have to think about what we ate anymore. So you could give your kids sugary crap for breakfast and they'll eat it because it's full of sugar. And then you could take them to McDonald's or fast food restaurants and buy them a Coca-Cola and get them crap for lunch, and they'll eat that because the food industry did such a good job of making it palatable. And then the same for dinner. And nobody had to think about it anymore. But there are people who think about it all the time, or the vegetarians and vegans have to think deeply about what they're eating and daily about making a healthy diet. And anyone who's a foodie does it naturally. And there's nothing more important to us. That's the fascinating thing. It's at least tied for being the single most important thing we can do in our lives, which is eat healthy. And it just requires some thought and practice to do it right. Nobody gets good at anything without practice. The longer you do it, the easier it becomes. And meanwhile, we've been getting these messages from the nutrition community. Don't even think about doing it. If you abstain from if you don't eat an entire food group, that's an eating disorder. If it's unsustainable, don't try it anyway. Nobody can eat this way. Even though it'll make you healthier, we're not going to tell you to do it because we don't believe you'll sustain it. I mean, sort of insane logic from the nutrition community. Whereas what they should be saying is being healthy takes work. And so eat a diet that's designed physiologically to make you healthy, which this is, and then work at it. So it gets easier. And now, of course, the food industry has settled in. So there are sort of, you can go on Amazon and buy a gazillion, keto-friendly snacks. And
Frankenfoods.
God knows, what they're
Frankenfoods. I'm sorry,
doing
but
for us, but they're there.
I
was confronted yesterday with keto macaroons. I was always a big macaroon fan. And I'm staring at the Amazon ad and blowing up the nutrition profile so I could see it going, wait a minute. They say it's keto friendly. It's still like 14 grams of carbs. I just think I'll be helped.
You could probably tolerate 2, maybe 3 of those.
And I could probably be very happy eating them, but I'm also very happy without eating them.
Yeah.
And so ultimately I passed.
Good for you. Gary, I define wellness as being the healthiest, fittest, and happiest you can be. What are 3 strategies or tactics to get and stay well?
Okay, well, I'm a big fan of telling people what not to eat. Okay, I know other people don't like negative messages, but don't eat sugar, starches, and grains. Wear a mask. And, I don't know if I got a third. I'm a writer. We're tortured, right? So telling people how to be happy, I feel like I'm not sure I'm certified to do that. But, get outside. And one of the things that happened, by the way, used to be, so part of the logic of the nutrition world is, right, you tell people to exercise. Because if you exercise, maybe they'll burn off calories. And I think of this as like a greyhound. The greyhounds of the world, figuring if they could just get the basset hounds to run around the track enough, they could turn the basset hounds into greyhounds. And what they end up doing is torturing the basset hounds, and you end up with emaciated, starving, exhausted basset hounds. But if you can make those basset hounds healthy with the right diet, if that diet sort of re-regulates their fat metabolism such that they're mobilizing fat from their fat tissue and burning it rather than storing it to excess, they'll have energy. And if they have energy, they'll want to exercise. And they'll want to burn that energy off, which lean people do naturally. And then they'll want to go for walks and go for hikes and go to the gym and all those great things and get outside because they'll have the energy to do it. And so you don't exercise or get physically active to lose weight. If you fix your fat accumulation problem, you will want to be physically active. So do the former and then enjoy the latter.
Excellent. So Gary, if someone wanted to learn more about you and or the book, The Case for Keto, where would you like for me to send them?
Okay, well, my website is GaryTaubes.com. I don't keep up with blogging, but it's there. Twitter is at Gary Taubes. The book is available if you have an independent bookstore in your neighborhood that's still open. Please buy it there. If not, Amazon will deliver.
Absolutely. Well, Gary, thank you so much for being a part of 40 Plus Fitness.
Alan, thank you for having me.
Rachel, welcome back.
Hey, Alan. Wow, that was a really fascinating interview. There's so much to talk about.
Yeah, like I said, I really like Gary, and I like his approach in his books, predominantly because he doesn't take anything as fact at first. It's not like he's going to follow and say, okay, here's our belief system, so I'm going to rest all of my argument on that thing. And a lot of people will do that. They'll say, you don't need to do keto because it'll raise your cholesterol. Some people get on keto and it lowers their cholesterol. Keto definitely lowers your triglycerides. It does a lot of other things that are really, really good for you. But it's not for everybody, as Gary mentioned in the podcast. But, if you're thinking about going to your doctor and you're thinking about doing keto, or you're doing keto and you go to your doctor and doctor says, oh my God, get off that, you're going to die. Just realize that doctors are not infallible. And I don't mean for you to completely question your doctor, but realize at one point doctors were recommending cigarettes. You had advertisements, 9 out of 10 doctors prefer a particular brand of cigarette. Now, they didn't know They were not told in medical school that the tobacco was bad for them. And in fact, the tobacco companies went out of their way to make sure that information was not available to your doctor. So doctors were recommending cigarettes. Now they're recommending different things. But some of our doctors went to medical school 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago. And a lot of them are still relying on the same things they were taught then, or they're relying on the things that that they get at their conferences. They have to do their continuing education. I don't know what they call it. We call it CEUs in a personal training space. We used to call it CPE when I was an accountant. But they have to go back and get education. Now, these educations are typically conferences, and these conferences are typically sponsored and run by drug companies. So most of the science, most of the things they're hearing are not food can make you healthy. It's you need this medicine to be healthy. And we don't have a deficiency of medicine. we have a problem with our food. And Gary does an excellent job of kind of walking us through step by step the case for keto. And so if your doctor's saying maybe you shouldn't be on that deal, highlight his objections, highlight them in your book, take the book to your doctor and have him read that section. You need to do some of that stuff. I remember when I was going through my first divorce. It sounds terrible, doesn't it? When I was going through the process of the settlement and everything that happens, and she was going to get half of my 401k. And so, I happened at that point in time to be reading a lot of things about divorce and about, 401ks and all that other stuff. And it said, you need this document called a QDRO. Okay. It's qualified something. Basically, it's where you're redeeming your 401k, but you're not taking the cash. So you do the form, and that way for your taxes, you don't have to pay taxes on the money you withdrew. Otherwise, you do. And then, so the story was about a doctor who took $1 million out of his 401k and basically had to pay $500,000 in taxes because he didn't do this one document. So I went to my attorney and I said, well, have you drawn up a QDRO? And he's like, what's that? So I showed him my research, and I went to another law firm, a friend at another law firm, and requested a boilerplate for one and gave it to my attorney. And he charged me my hourly rate for his time to read my research and do the form, which I thought was really, really not cool. But at least I saved myself a ton in taxes because I was aware of the situation, and I was a part of my own legal team. I didn't just depend on the opinions and requirements that are put forward by my attorney. I made sure I understood the process as well as I could, so that I could be a part of the team. And you really kind of have to do the same thing with your medical, because doctors are not infallible. They're human beings just like us. They're very intelligent human beings, and they're very diligent because they did go through medical school. But at the same time, they're not doing the research specific to you every single day. You have to do that research.
That's right. You need to take your own reins of your own nutritional choices, and it's good to ask questions. It's good to question the doctor and help them, or they can help you better once they know what you're trying to find out. But yeah, nutritional guidance has changed so much. But the problem is that it hasn't been reflected in our country in our guidelines. The food pyramid, as we knew it growing up, was like that for probably 15 years. I know that there were changes in the food pyramid. If it wasn't last year, it was the year before. And it had been literally 10 years in between any additional changes to what we know. And it's only one dietary example to live by. And it's not the right dietary example for everybody.
Yeah. Well, one of the things is realize that's a very politicized environment. Nina Chisolds she wrote the Big Fat Lie, I believe is the book she wrote. And she's been an activist on this thing the whole time. And the reality of it is, when they get the people together in the room, the scientists that are supposed to go through these studies, they sit down and they look at all the studies, and then they start throwing some of them out as irrelevant or not valid. And all of the high-fat, low-carb diets, every single one of them was excluded from the study.
Mm.
And so, she's part of an organization that's out there trying to fight this, but they're moving forward with nutrition guidance. And, basically probably for a generally healthy person that doesn't have metabolic problems, it's not obese or overweight, those guidelines might work just fine. But for a lot of us that are, I guess easily fattened, I think was one of the terms I heard recently in an interview. That interview is coming up, guys. But easily fattened, us easily fattened people, we can't eat that way. We can't fuel that way. And unfortunately, that's not going to be a part of the guidelines. I was talking to a nutritionist out of Canada, and she'll be on the show soon. And it was kind of the same thing. We were talking about the nutrition guidelines. She says, yeah, Canada has changed their guidelines. They don't have all of the grains and all that stuff anymore. They've lowered that down and they've got it, a little bit more balance. And I said, the United States is still charging forward with the 11 servings of grain.
Yes.
And she's like, that's insane. And I'm like, it's politics. And so again, your doctor's doing the best he can with his standard of care and his education. So just recognize you have to be a part of these decisions. If you know that you need to go in for a surgery and they're going to put a magic mark on the leg they're supposed to operate on, you check that mark.
Yes.
Don't just assume that they marked the right leg, and when maybe it was supposed to be the left leg, but make sure that they marked the right leg. Make sure that the information your doctor is giving you. Now, you do need your doctor to be involved. And here's one of the core reasons. If you're on metformin, some other blood sugar lowering medication, blood sugar lowering medication, or you're on insulin, your medication is very likely going to change if you change what you eat.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay. So a significant change in your diet is something you do need to talk to your doctor about. Like I said, he or she may object on the grounds that they don't believe that's a healthy, sustainable way of eating. But if you went in there and said, I'm going to go vegan or vegetarian, and they'd be like, okay, that's great. And it's like, and keto.
Silence.
Then they'll be like, yeah, crickets. But it's possible. Yeah. And we've had them on too. So, I think the key of this whole thing is if you really want some support when you're talking to family members, you want some support when you're talking to doctors. The only thing that I wish Gary was a doctor. He's a journalist, but he did take the time to get to the root cause. He did go take the time to put together the history, to put together the case. And so to me, this book is like gold if you're trying to explain to someone why you're doing what you're doing.
I think it's worth reading and experimenting. After listening to your podcast for a couple of years, you talked about keto for quite a bit, and I wasn't ready to accept that keto was a healthy diet to follow or a lifestyle to follow. And I had a hard time unlearning all of the things that I knew for fact that fat was bad for you. I mean, really, I had to really come off of all of those things that I had just taken for true science, but so much has changed. But I knew that if I didn't do something different, that I wasn't going to get where I wanted to be. And so I, just like Gary had mentioned, I just did an experiment, and I told Mike, my husband, I said, I'm going to try this and see how it works. If it doesn't work, then I'll try something else. But 2 years, almost 3 years later, I'm still basically following the keto lifestyle because it is working for me.
Right.
Everybody needs to try that. Something different.
Yes. If what you're doing is not working, you got to do something different if you expect a different outcome.
Yep. And I know some people can be vegan or vegetarian. I know, like Gary had mentioned, he's got a friend who's a vegan keto and another friend who's carnivore. It really is such an individual thing. And I respect anybody who can be vegan. Just as much as I respect anybody that can be keto. The fact is that they found something that works with the way that their body works. And that's exciting.
So in the show notes, I'm gonna make a point to. I've had a carnivore on, I've had a vegan keto on, and I've had Dr. Will Cole on, where he was pretty much somewhere in the lines between vegan and pescatarian. So I'm going to link to those. So awesome. If those are ways of eating that you're wanting to do, and then you also want to consider trying keto, or at least a low carb version of those diets. I'll put the links in there for you to check those out, because there's a lot of good information in those episodes to just kind of give you an idea of what's possible.
Perfect. I think that'll be so helpful.
All right. Well, Rachel, I'll talk to you next week.
Great. Take care.
Next time on the 40 Plus Fitness podcast, we bring on running coach Rachel Everett to discuss running after 40. Until then, have a happy and healthy week.